Hello, welcome to this introductory lesson, introductory recording, introductory information session around the fifth module in the FAB semester, namely Advancing Occupational Justice. As you can see from the picture, I'm in Ghent and my name's Mike Jarry. For those of you who haven't met me, I've been working as a teacher on the FAB semester on and off for years. I also teach in different modules at Artevalde, and I used to give this lesson, this information moment, shall we say, live as part of the kickoff for this module. But I know that this year there's some timing constraints, and it was decided to do this online as something you can do as a preparatory exercise. So I hope that you guys will find everything you need, or certainly enough to kick you off in this module. Essentially, we're doing occupational therapy on an organizational level. Essentially, that's what this is about, all right? We want to bring to you guys the, I guess, realization, the the understanding that occupational therapy isn't only about the individual or the family or the community. It can also be about organizations. And what I'm going to explain to you today is a model, a framework that we use within occupational therapy and certainly within occupational science, because this is not necessarily only for occupational therapists, but we'll talk about that a bit later. Obviously, OTs are the best people to use it, but anyway, it's about looking at things on a slightly different perspective, which is always good, and also what we do in the FAB semester. So, first of all, we're going to do a small exercise together. Now, you may have seen this before. This is called the Wheel of Power and Privilege. Now, I'd like you to pause me just for a minute. And when you do that, have a look at this and ask yourself where you sit on this wheel. Now, as you can see, it's a wheel that's split up into different components. But the idea is the closer on each component you get to the center, the more power you wield. And this is a really interesting and really important thinking exercise to do about your own positionality. And it's really important that when we're working with people, with organizations, that we're aware of our positionality, because we bring a certain power dynamic to everything we do. And so what I want you to do is think of this as something that you keep with you, something that you always have in the back of your mind. A bit like over the years you've learned to use a model of practice. Now it's become your lens, the way you see people, the way you frame your clients. Well, this may help you in some ways to think about how there are power dynamics within healthcare, within social care, and we need to be aware of them too, because we're working with different people, from different backgrounds, different people from different socio-economic statuses, and we need to be aware of what we bring to that relationship. So just pause me for a minute, have a look at this wheel, discuss it with each other if you're watching this together with someone else, and see what you think. Okay, so hopefully you've had a bit of time now to think about your own positionality. For what it's worth, I do this as well. This is not just for me, not just for you, it's for me as well. And of course, me being a white, English speaking, highly educated, if you like, European male puts me in the center of that power and privileged wheel, and pretty much all of every component. Now, one thing that I hope, if you're in a similar situation, it certainly makes me feel is humble. We talk about cultural humility, for example, and about recognizing your position in a power dynamic or in a power relationship. So being aware of the privilege and the power that I hold when it comes to things like occupational justice, it certainly helps to equalize the relationship you have with your client or your community or your organization. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the POJF, the Participatory Occupational Justice Framework. Now, this occupational justice framework is the model that underpins this module, this FAB Module 5, Advancing Occupational Justice. The idea of the framework is to frame organizations, frame groups in a way that enables us to ask that question, are they advancing occupational justice? So we're going to talk about essentially why occupational justice. We're going to have a look at the pillars of occupational therapy knowledge. So this is all underpinning theory, underpinning this framework. We're going to have a look at how occupational justice fits with other concepts of justice, and then we'll briefly look at the framework itself. But if you're anything like me, there's the best way of learning how to use something like this is in the application of it, and that's obviously what you'll be doing this week. So let's talk a little bit about the background. Let's talk a bit about the underpinning theory, and then you can get to work and hopefully enjoy using it. So why do occupational therapists enable occupation? Why is occupational justice for us as occupational therapists so important? Now, this is one of many different definitions linked to occupational justice. And this is from Hocking, Claire Hocking, important person within occupational science. She took the work of Anne Wilcock further on in Occupational Perspective of Health. She's also the editor of the Journal of Occupational Science. And she said that occupational justice is concerned with enabling, mediating, and advocating for environments in which all people's opportunities to engage in occupation are just, health promoting, and meaningful. Now, I think that's also a definition for us as occupational therapists, and a kind of almost a vision or a mission for occupational therapists. We need to be enabling, that's one core element of our work, but also mediating between two groups, or a group and a person, and also advocating for environments in which people's opportunities to engage in occupation are just, so fair, health promoting, and of course, most importantly, meaningful, so that they have meaning in their everyday lives. So I think if you're going to have an underpinning definition which helps you through this module, think about those three things: enabling, mediating, and advocating. I think they really help with thinking about why and how occupational justice is, how it looks and how we have to deal with it in a practice context. So I wanted just to talk about some of the different types of occupational justice. We're just going to do this very quickly. As you know, there's a lot of different terms these days in occupational therapy, in occupational science. Some of them more popular or more commonly used than others. So for example, you have occupational alienation. That's one that we use quite a lot. So that may be that people are engaging in occupations, engaging in activities that don't mean anything to them. You may have someone who is a an asylum seeker, a refugee in another country, and they're being expected to engage in something that means nothing to them. I don't know, for example, to do with daily routines in a work setting, or um, they're expected to go and get involved in some kind of community project where they just have no uh, background, they have no story, they have no reason for being there, so they feel alienated by the things they have to do. um, Deprivation is also, occupational deprivation is about, where, basically, people who through external factors, or physical factors, or mental factors, are unable to uh, engage in meaningful occupations. They're deprived of the opportunity to engage in meaningful occupations. That often sits next to disruption, for example. Of course, we saw in the pandemic a massive global example of occupational disruption. Disruption tends to be temporary, so it's a temporary um, break in our ability to engage in our meaningful activities. Often one that, if we're privileged and powerful enough, we can break through out of the other side of, which most of us gladly did from the pandemic. Um, for example, one example that's often used is that a pregnancy is seen as an occupational disruption. Here in Flanders, for example, primary school teachers, as soon as they're pregnant, they have to stop working. So they're not able to um, continue working because the rules, the external organizations that uh, say what has to happen, means they can't do that. So they're temporarily disrupted with their ability to go to work, for example, which is a very small example. Of course, the pandemic is a great example to use when we're talking about occupational injustices. You had people who already had severe occupational deprivation. It just embedded those deprivations, that inability to carry out your everyday activities, even more. So it was kind of a strengthening of that deprivation. Maybe just one more, occupational imbalance. You can look at that from an individual perspective, but also on a population-based perspective, and that's about having, some people call that also life balance. So you know, we have different kinds of occupational injustices, and I don't think it's necessary for you to necessarily know and understand all of these, although I think the basic ones we've just talked about, the ones that we know most about. But I think it's important that you start to realize and start to understand that occupational justice is a widely used, widely researched, and often in different ways defined concept, depending on context, and depending on the situation for the person or communities. So most of this, what we're talking about today, is coming from the chapter that escapes me now exactly which one. I think it's chapter 18 in the Occupational Therapies Without Borders book. And the participatory occupational justice framework was originally worked out by Gail Whiteford and Elizabeth Townsend. And in their work, in those books, I think there's a version in each of the volumes of those Occupational Therapies Without Borders book. We use the latest one, of course, for this course. And in those books, they underpin that framework. And one of the ways they do that is with this 4 pillars of occupational therapy knowledge. So, uh, it's a what, how, why, and where exercise. So, what is our core knowledge? What is the core knowledge of occupational therapy? Well, that's about occupations, about participation in necessarily obligatory and voluntary occupations, or in other words, everyday life. So that's our core knowledge. We are the experts of everyday life. How do we do that? We do that by collaborative, person-centered occupational therapy with individuals, families, communities, and populations, or in other words, empowerment. We empower people and their populations and their networks and their context to engage in meaningful occupations. Why do we do that? Why do we enable occupation? Well, we want to enact social change. We want to reduce everyday injustices, and we want to advance occupational justice, hence the title of this module. And that means that we are having an effect on social inclusion. We'll talk again about social injustices in just a second. But where do occupational therapists engage with these things? In which context? So we engage with occupations that are situated physically, but also historically and socio-culturally and politically. And occupational therapists actively use this knowledge wherever they work. So we understand that occupations have a physical context, they have an historical context, there's often a story behind them, there's cultural and social elements to it, but also, and we're going to focus that, you're going to focus on that quite a lot this week, this political element, because we have to understand that often the things that we are able to do as professionals, or the things that people are able to do as people, are influenced by political decisions. So I just mentioned then a second ago about concepts of justice. Now, there is a bit of criticism within the profession around sticking the word occupational on everything. So it's important that if we're going to talk about these concepts, that we are able to place them in bigger theoretical frameworks, bigger theoretical uh, conversations. Now, social justice is often one that's used, but social justice is also a kind of umbrella term for different types of justice. So here you can see, for example, a table about different kinds of justice, and I won't go through all of them, but we can just maybe use one of them. So one type of social justice is restorative justice, where it's concerned with repairing something that's gone wrong or renewing something that's broken, for example. This may be something that has about damage to your goods, whether you've been attacked or whether you've been um, you've crashed your car, or someone's broken into your house. So you have this restorative justice. You have a right to restorative justice in order to have your property it reimbursed, for example, but also that the perpetrators, the people that do that, are restored back into society in some way, but also restitution is given to the victims. So it's kind of, it's around justice in the traditional sense, in the law sense, and that's a form of social justice. Occupational justice is actually a form of participatory justice, so that falls again under the social justice umbrella. So it's around, as you know, engaging in meaningful occupations. Um, it's around classification, so social versus economic value of occupations, competing needs for opportunities and resources. So this is the areas where you see the justices being created, or the injustices being created, competing between opportunities and resources, for example. The aim of it is to enable different opportunities and resources, taking differences and into account in social structures. Their power, we talked about power already. There's issues of power around opportunities and resources, as I mentioned, and in the enablement of full participation from all citizens, all individuals, families, and social groups. So the other side of that, of course, is something like occupational marginalization, for example. And then, of course, it's about enabling difference within that social justice. So everyone has a right to engage in their occupation, in their meaningful occupations. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into how occupational justice fits within this concept of social justice. Now, you'll see in the chapter that hopefully you're going to read, if you haven't already, please do. I think it's in the reading materials that you've got or will be given for this module. Whiteford and Townsend, obviously being critical researchers, didn't just publish their work, they asked people to critique their work, which you do in a research setting. And they received a lot of feedback, and much of it was critical, and I think that's a good thing, and I think they think that's a good thing, and so much so that they came up with these 6 articles. Now, these 6 articles, in my view, are kind of six, well, no, almost like a manifesto. This is what you need in order to be able to use something like the participatory occupational justice framework. These are 6 kind of like points that you need to take with you everywhere you go. So, for example, we need to understand that occupational therapists strive to engage in critical reflexivity, to constantly challenge gaps between specific OT philosophy, theories, and everyday practice, as well as between universal principles of human rights and institutional policies, practices, and environmental conditions. Now, just very simply, this is about never kind of accepting the status quo. So it's about constantly challenging gaps in practice, in OT theory, in the philosophy behind OT. It's about saying, we're never satisfied. We're always going to question things. It's this idea of critical occupational therapy. So we're always moving forward. We're always questioning what we're doing. Very important. So that's Article 1. Article 2 is about occupational therapists' aim to be collaborative and participatory in all stages of decision making. Again, this is about power. Just like the last one was about this idea of, not accepting the power that gives us all this work, that's the be all and end all. It's also about saying the power that we have with our clients. It needs to be collaborative. It needs to be participatory all the way through the process of decision making. And that means that your client, your family, your community are equal with you with regards to the decision-making processes. Article 3 is about the means and ends of social inclusion for the people with whom you work, who are or may be at risk of becoming marginalized, disadvantaged or oppressed. So essentially, this is about you have this idea of means and ends of social inclusion. So occupation can be a means, occupation can be something you use in your everyday practice, but it's also an end. It's also where you're striving towards. You're always striving to enable occupation. We're not using occupation in order to improve functional capacities, or we're not using occupations or activities to strengthen physical bodily functions. It's about enabling occupation to ensure that people have less opportunities to be marginalized, disadvantaged, or oppressed. So it's about always having our vision at the end of what we do. At the end, not just the means, both means and end. Now, Article 4 is about occupational therapy approaches and methods that should seek to engage people as individuals, but also as families and communities in obligatory, necessary, and voluntary occupations, which are deemed culturally appropriate by those persons individually or collectively. Now, yeah, I don't know how many in your training programs we often talk about this culturally appropriateness, and it's something that we seem to say very easily. But I think in practice, and maybe you'll come across this with some of the organizations that you're going to look at in the coming week, being culturally appropriate is much harder than one might think. We live in a diverse society, and all peoples, as we've already talked about, all peoples have a right to engage in culturally appropriate um, occupations. Um, Article 5 is about equity, equitable resources, equitable opportunities. So, occupational therapy collaborative objectives are those ideally aimed at ensuring more equitable opportunities and resources are available for people to exert optimal levels of control and choice in everyday occupation. So, no group should have more than or less than another group. No one is more important when it comes to access to services, when it comes to access to resources, to money, for example. We have to strive for equity when it comes to the the sharing of resources and the giving of opportunities. And then finally, Article 6. So this one is pretty profound, I think, but also perhaps the most important one. When we strive to work with others in pursuit of the ideal of occupational justice, it's irrespective of political and economical challenges and current environmental limitations. In other words, hope and vision of possibility underpins our intentions. Now, think about that just for a minute. So, we have to have hope. We have to have a vision that these things are possible. We have to, and dare I say it, we have to believe that as occupational therapists, we are in pursuit of this ideal of occupational justice. We have to believe where we're going. We have to have a vision in our minds that it's possible. Okay, so that was the 6 articles. This was the feedback. This was the critique that the authors of the POJF received, and they put together into these 6 articles. And like I said, they're a kind of manifesto. What I would suggest you do is kind of what I just did verbally, which is to decant the 6 articles into a small sentence, something that means something to you, and write that up somewhere. Keep that in the back of your notepad or something, because they're actually 6 really nice points to keep with you as you go through your training and go through your career. So we're going to go through the POJF now. There's kind of 2 parts to it. The first part we call the enabling processes. I'm just going to quickly skip forward to this part. This is also the second part of the framework, and together they're called the POJF, and this is the contextual drivers. So if you have a look at this contextual drivers, the blue circle in the middle is your organization. And if we go back to the slide before, this is what's in that blue circle. Okay, so you've got what we call collaborative enabling processes. So they are not linear. It's not like a OT process. This is all things happening at the same time. So, for example, raising consciousness of occupational justice is an organization actively raising consciousness of occupational justice. Is it part of their vision and mission? Is it part of their activities of working? And are they really conscious and raising consciousness of occupational justice? That's the blue one at the top. And then you have things, for example, around engaging collaboratively with partners. You may have someone who has got it all perfect on their website, but actually in reality they're not engaging collaboratively with partners. They're working unilaterally, for example. Do they have a plan? Do they mediate agreement on a plan? Is there something that's happening on paper? Do they have an actual plan worked out for the next 2 years, or is there something that's actually agreed between different partners and where they're going to, for example? Do they have strategy for resources and funding? Is this something that has on paper? Do they have somewhere where they can say, look, our plan, the agreement and the plan that we've made with our partners is dependent on this budget, and this much money goes to these people and this much money goes to these people, and is it equitable? Because that's one of our articles, remember. Do they support implementation, and do they continually evaluate? There's a really fundamental point about this whole idea. You can have a wonderful idea, you can start your project, but if you don't continually evaluate, if you don't support the implementation of your plan as you go along, then really you don't know what's happening. You don't know what's successful. You don't know what needs to be changed or adapted or rethought throughout the time of the project. And then finally, you've got this inspiring advocacy and sustainability or closure. So this idea that we're advocating occupational justice and we're looking at sustainable projects that go on perhaps on further than the end of the so-called funding for that project. Actually, they become part of the way that another company works, or part of the way that your company or your organization works. But also about closure, about saying, you know what, this isn't working. This needs to stop. This is something we need to finish. So these 6 enabling processes are the things that the occupational justice framework wants to see or wants to uh, frame and focus on within a particular organization. Now, you guys this week, I don't think will have time to look at every single one. You may want to base your questions that you may want to ask people around these 6 enabling processes. I would recommend you do that. But, maybe 1 or 2 of them or 2 or 3 of them will come out at you strongly and you can focus on those. The idea is that you understand that these things are not linear, they're all happening at the same time. It's about enabling, it's about this idea of working together and resources. It all fits into these 6 articles that we discussed earlier. However, really important, as I said before, this is your organization, this is your group, your community, and this sits within different contexts. And the idea now is, we talk about context with our clients all the time. We talk about how important environment is, but how far do we go when we talk about that? Now, if that blue circle is your group, your organization, you have this next level of your practice context, for example, the environmental systems and the governance of your organization, whether it's a company in Ghent that has to follow some rules or has resources allocated by the city, for example. Then the next circle is more of a national and political level. Which legislation, which governance is happening from a national point of view? I mean, for example, in Belgium, there's the federal level and the Flemish level. Now, they all have different roles and different focuses on these kind of things. So understanding these things, and that's why they're called drivers, understanding these things help you to understand how they make things possible for organizations, or how they make things much more difficult for organizations in order to be able to enable occupation. So it's about not just saying, are you mediating, are you advocating, are you enabling? It's about understanding the drivers of the context which will define what's possible for that organization and what's possible for that group. And then finally, of course, you've got this wider regional and global context. Now, for us in Belgium, and for you guys in Austria and Finland, and if you're from another country, of course that tends to be a European thing. Often the European Union is something that defines so much of our daily lives these days, and not necessarily a good or bad thing. Let's perhaps not be too judgmental, but understanding it is a really powerful tool in order to be able to understand the enabling processes. Okay, so I hope that's kind of clear. So you've got this is your organization. This is the chaos that happens in an everyday organization, and somehow you need to understand it. You need to look at as much as you can, ask as many questions as you can based on these enabling processes. And then if you can, bring that organization into a bigger picture, into the local, the national, and the international context, which drives the possibilities of occupational justice or injustices within your organization. So it's a non-linear, interrelated processes. So those processes are not happening in a nice long row. They're happening all at the same time, all within each other, through each other. But power relations are key. This is where this contextual drivers comes in, where this being aware of power relations is really important. Having this critical OT perspective is really important as well. Having those articles in your back pocket, thinking about how I'm going to engage with this project as a critical occupational therapist. And then, of course, understanding the context again, which is, I guess, that's just one of the things we're good at, but perhaps we need to be better at the bigger context, because the bigger context, political, organizational, around laws, around culture, all these things really define what's possible for us on a everyday basis. And the more we understand that, the more we can look at how we can mediate, enable, and advocate for occupational justice. Okay, so finally, this is a page from the book in Occupational Therapies Without Borders, for the chapter for this framework. You'll find some reflective questions. Now, some of them are quite complicated. Some of them are quite difficult, but that's fine. Difficult is okay. But what I suggest you do is you don't use them verbatim to ask questions of your organization or your group. Use them to help discussions in your group. Discuss the reflective questions based on the different enabling processes. So each of the different guiding questions or different focuses is designed for you to discuss and to begin to understand, not necessarily give you a load of questions to ask someone. So use them more as reflective questions. Use them more to stimulate discussion within your groups than to, well, you may adapt some in order to ask them in interviews or something, but use them to enable your understanding of the POJF as opposed to just a list of questions. Okay, well, I hope that was interesting. I hope that was useful, and you have an idea now or an understanding more about this framework, this POJF. My colleagues from Austria and Finland and of course at Artevelde in Ghent will now help you through this week and coach you through these moments. But if you try and keep hold of these articles, the 6 articles, give you that critical perspective, understand how these enabling processes work within these bigger, wider contextual drivers. Hopefully you can start seeing how occupational therapists can have an impact on a organizational level, on a higher level when it comes to advancing occupational justice. Good luck.